Well, here we are speaking about one of the most important topics for digital, cultural and social studies, and also for digital science, which is what is the role of public engagement of institutions, of universities in the digital age, 20 years after the beginning of the internet as we now know it, and what responsibilities do we have, what opportunities do we have, and what kind of future can we imagine for libraries and for the presentation of digital knowledge?
I think that it's huge, but I tell you what has been really provoking me is this idea of public life. I try to understand what role technology is having presently, and also what role technology can have in enabling a public life. This idea of spaces or forums or places or access points for communities to either share information or to engage. And I'm drawn back to this definition of an institution each time I go in there, because I know institutions are, social constructs. And because my background is in the collecting world, that's a really big part of a collecting institution as a social institution, to provide spaces for public engagement and to cultivate that exchange of information and ideas. And research institutions, of course, like universities that you work in, Paul, are the same.
When we were speaking before this session, you were mentioning the great change that's happened over a number of centuries now in the role of libraries. In fact, we're talking about that massive movement, or that shift that happened in the 19th century in particular, the idea of the public library, of accessibility, which we now think of in terms of digital access, in terms of open access, in terms of shareability, findability, all those sorts of concepts that are familiar in the digital world. But there's sometimes a danger in thinking that this is all about newness and all about now, whereas in fact, arguably, I don't know what your thinking would be around this, the mission of libraries has always been to provide this kind of access, but that there was that turning point, maybe it's in the 19th century, when public access became the priority.
Yeah, I think that's it's interesting. When we did have a discussion before this, I mentioned a video I'd seen, a talk given by the Harvard University librarian about the ideas behind the Digital Public Library of America. And he referenced libraries as also towers, as in places to actually keep people out. And he also referenced the Boston Public Library, mid-19th century, I think it was, as I guess, one of those first libraries that wanted to provide access for all with those Enlightenment ideas of equity of access. And I think there's an inscription in the masonry above the entrance that says free to all or free for all. And these incredibly big ideas that came through Enlightenment, we are seeing quite an incredible transformation happening in our cultural institutions in the way those spaces are actually being reformed to enable that public engagement with cultural heritage material, that's for sure. We're also seeing that in the university sector too, with on-site versus online lectures and distributed learning through MOOCs and that kind of thing. So I do wonder a little bit about how we maintain that idea through that process of implementing technology to enable that. And that has certainly been, I guess it's a compass for me as a professional, an absolute compass for me in terms of how is what I'm doing having an impact on a community that I'm there to serve. So I do wonder about that idea of access, and some of what we haven't really understood has been protected by some of those old infrastructures. Because I once explained to somebody that the idea of open and free access to all is a very Western construct, and that's not necessarily a construct of other cultures at all. The information is privileged, and very consciously so.
just picking up on that point and also thinking still for a moment historically, 100, 200 years ago, literacy rates, for example, were much lower, but also the class structures and, values and institutions only allowed access to certain people, to reading rooms, to those protected sources of knowledge.
Yep.
Protected in one sense for those kind of social reasons and structures, but also they were simply inaccessible to those who couldn't read them. And, I think that it's still important to think in terms of strategies to enable greater access. It's still important to remember that the vast increase in literacy rates around the world, even in those other countries that mightn't have the same sorts of values that we have in Australia, where we're doing this recording and where we work, as an example of one country with such values of openness and of democracy and of access. And a bit like the pressure that's been placed on universities for increasing public education, libraries and facilitators of knowledge and preservers of documentation of our documentary heritage, our cultural heritage, they have huge pressures now on them, not only because people want more access and there are more people who are literate and people who quite rightfully wish to access these materials, but also because those same people now are producing a vast amount of new material, which we might put under the heading of, public contributions to knowledge. And this is another shift, an entirely different shift, which libraries themselves have had to account for, which is the public production of knowledge that would have once been, for all sorts of reasons, much more in expert hands.
Oh, yes, a preserve. It's interesting you say that. I was reading a fairly provocative piece on digital humanities in the Los Angeles, I think, Review of Books this morning. I'm sorry to the authors, I can't recall the title, but one of the aspects of that I found interesting was about the discussion of the canon, because some of my undergraduate was in literature. And when I moved into cultural heritage, I began to understand a whole lot more about documentary history and what documentary history in terms of collecting meant in terms of representativeness. And so there are very interesting issues of social equity that actually go into collecting, such that I've actually explained to people that even though you have legal deposit in place, and I practiced as a heritage professional in New Zealand, that does not mean that you are able to effectively collect everything that is published. And there are barriers to your ability to collect. The first being able to know about it, the second being able to retrieve it. And in the area of music, and I worked in the Turnbull Library, one of the curators there that looked after contemporary music had to go to quite significant efforts to actually secure access to contemporary music, because there's limited editions. Often they're done by people who have other jobs, and so their ability to actually produce their music is based on a very fragile kind of economic base. And there was a massive campaign to try and engage musicians so that there was a record of New Zealand's contemporary music captured, but that it wouldn't actually jeopardise their potential income or capacity to market it commercially. So there were very interesting questions when we moved to digital collecting around representativeness and the role of the curator in selecting materials so that you actually get a mixture of voices coming through. And I once explained to someone, I tried to simplify it. I said, there's various signals that we generate as a community, and it's really important not to have loud signals or many signals drown out the long tail of signals. We actually want to be able to capture a range of signals that come through our communities' production of cultural material or whatever it is that they do. When it comes to big data, that gets pretty tricky because it's massive. But I think it's something we have to grapple with. It's really important.
I think that you're heading here towards maybe what I would say is the big challenge for us socially, technically, intellectually, in the digital age. And it's not around questions, I would say, of is the book dead, or, you know, what's the future of ebooks, or what kind of modalities are we going to use to present and share and access our knowledge. The questions become much bigger. The time for those debates passed. And the question, I think, now, in the context of what you're referring to with this vast amount of data, and also the possibilities of data capture and of digital representation of objects of knowledge and of our documentary and cultural heritage, the question is, how can we collect this? How can we preserve it? How can we preserve it in time that it is not lost? And that's in the case of cultural heritage, which can be more of the kind of intangible sort of voices, of stories, of Indigenous knowledges, of these things that we have the capacity to capture. But how do we do it when even the processing of this vast data, as is well illustrated in the case of astronomy, you know, it takes off a massive institutional, theoretical, you know, research effort even to work through, or just simply to transfer the data into an appropriate format for it to have some kind of longevity, because we also struggle against almost the opposite set of pressures, which is the fragility of the digital in contrast to paper.
That's interesting you say that, because what immediately came to mind was a project that lit my heart up a bit, because it is kind of and it's not a predictable move, but it is predictable. And this relates to that tension between constancy and change, and that we have a constant role to provide access to material and to engage publicly and to ensure people have the ability to get access to knowledge. There's a development of something called the Data Cube here in Australia, and it's constructed by Geoscience Australia, I think with other partners. And what I love about this is that it's kind of turned the model of collecting on its head again, where collecting in the digital realm can mean that everybody has copies, and it's, you know, you mentioned an early work that you'd read about the massive availability of digital material, particularly when it's small scale, but this data cube is quite chunky, and so actually it's flipping the models that the researchers actually have to go to the cube, and the institutions who contribute the data to construct this cube, actually they retain their preservation copies, but this cube is actually where the researchers have to go. And we had this model years ago where researchers used to have to get travel grants to actually go to a place and to register as a reader and to go in and actually use the material. So I do think we are seeing models of public access and public engagement flipping around depending on what technical challenge we're actually confronting. And I love that, because it actually says they've retained their mission to support research by the development of this data cube, and they've worked out ways to continue to meet their mission, which is to preserve the scientific record of I guess, land-based data here in Australia.
You know, we're talking now about infrastructure, and we're talking about digital copies of other material, or representations at least of material that enables research, that forms a kind of data fabric for research, if you want to think about it in terms of another metaphor for for enabling and facilitating research, and for bringing together the many threads of research which are represented by research projects, by people's work over a lifetime, by the data holdings that are in different places and under different remits in different institutions. And I'm thinking here particularly about the difference between disciplines, and I wonder whether we might touch on this for a moment.
Sure.
It seems to me that within the humanities and social sciences, especially in the humanities, and we talked about music, so let's extend it right through to the arts, that the value and the infrastructural value of digitisation itself forms a kind of infrastructure platform and layer that has unique value for those sectors. And by that I mean that we often think about infrastructure in terms of the scanner or the telescope or the equipment that enables the transfer from analog to digital, or the observation and collection of data, and these sorts of processes. But what's happening in the humanities, arguably, is that the digitised material, you give the example of the National Library's digitised newspaper collection, one of the leading examples of that kind of program in the world, historical newspaper collection, that is an infrastructure in and of its own that people are now drawing upon, because it is the primary material of their research. It is what's being observed, it's what's being increasingly now also corrected, the OCR correction through crowdsourcing and through things like annotation and all sorts of other elements. But it's a difference in the kind of infrastructure that libraries and other institutions, archives, increasingly also museums as they move into digital preservation in a different way, but that they provide to the research community. They provide a different service and a different set of infrastructures for different disciplines.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I have had discussions with colleagues about this kind of new area of practice. And just before I get into that, just this morning I read an article a colleague had put out on Twitter about two different areas of science that refer to data archives as vital archives. And so this aspect of data as infrastructure is really key, because we understand it is the foundation on which research is built. So when I think about the digitised newspapers that the National Library has collated in collaboration with state libraries and other institutions here in Australia, I see that as a vital data archive. However, I bear in mind something that Richard Neville, the Mitchell librarian, said to me, and gee, it made me laugh. It took me back to being a library assistant, where he said to me, Ingrid, you would not want history simply written on the basis of what was printed in a newspaper. And he was absolutely right. In the sense of representativeness, if you take a documentary history lens to this and understand that that is just one presentation and format through which, ideas and knowledge is generated, and we would benefit from having here in Australia a really large and diverse archive of our cultural records, because then we can actually look at where the biases come through, where the presentation of what's construed of as a fact is actually not necessarily the case. And, newspapers as a form have changed over the last 100 or so years in what it is that they produce, and how people relied on newspapers in the past and how sceptical they are in contemporary times is quite interesting. So I do think from a disciplinary point of view, there is a lot of commonality around this explosion of data, in that we need to be quite resourceful and think hard about what we need to put in as foundations, because we can see this happening in the science, where they've established very clear cases of needing these data sources and needing technologies to help them do their research. And in terms of public life, there's this interesting crossover that the humanities has with this interchange around culture and opinion. And you and I have discussed, there's a phrase called citizen science. What is the equivalent in the humanities, arts and social science? If it's not citizen science, then what is it? So is it citizenry? Is it this concept of the public forum that we have a much stronger affinity to in the humanities, arts and social sciences, and science is actually an aspect of that. But I wondered whether that emergence of that phrase was because we identified this as a new area of engagement, public engagement emerging in science, and we wanted to put phrasing around it.
It's really important, because science has often placed a high, and had to place a high value on communication with the public, with publics, in order to translate and explain complex and highly, increasingly specialised. That's
Mm,
the path of science. Science has become increasingly specialised in subspecialisations of disciplines
mm.
as technology has enabled that kind of new and more focused inquiry in those domains. And to be able to translate back and to explain actually the huge investment that is made in and the kind of faith that's placed in scientific research, which is has immeasurable benefits in society and health and environment and all sorts of areas, but nevertheless the pure research behind that needs a great deal of translation in order for it to be understood by public.
Absolutely. That's so funny, Paul, because that article I read this morning, I could not recount to you the exact areas of science that they were in, because they are so very specific and detailed. Even some of the technology descriptions kind of left me a little perplexed. So I do think you're onto an interesting question there about the translation of knowledge, and perhaps a relationship between that and science and this concept of citizen science to break down that language and the complexity of that, definitely.
Yeah, I want to throw in here just the term and a moment to think about the field of digital humanities. This is a term often used. Our discussion is framed in a sense around this tension and productive dynamism between art and science, or between technology and social and cultural issues and research. And so if we're looking for a term or a lens through which to see that kind of space of interaction that is specifically related to humanities and social sciences, that is one of them we could choose. Of course, media studies and other kinds of areas have all dealt with this in other ways too, but something that's quite specific, I think, about the digital humanities term, and which has given it a kind of ability to travel around the world and to be adopted recently and have a great deal of currency, is that it suggests this coupling of computer science and of the highly specialised IT environments and knowledge that come with working closely with computing and with software, which of course are part of practically every part of our life now, bridging across and linking with and helping to illuminate new elements of that the study of culture and society, very broadly understood, which also includes an understanding of the role of science and a kind of critique of scientific knowledge versus other sorts of knowledge, which may be coming out of different discipline bases. So I think it is useful. Nevertheless, it suffers in some ways from being very broad now, although it may have come from particular disciplinary roots, and often in institutions, digital humanities grows out of certain environments. But the breadth, I would argue, is actually what is exciting about it, what allows it to be interpreted in new ways. What I was getting to is that it's coming out of libraries often, and the pioneers of many digital humanities centres, initiatives, certainly the facilitators and the meeting points and places for these kinds of dialogues is increasingly libraries, and that's partly because of the change in collection strategies. That means that now a lot more is digital, but also emphasis on engagement with publics and with research in physical spaces in libraries.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, because one of the issues raised in this article was about these foundational projects, as in the building up of resources and the creation of access layers to those resources. And what I think is interesting about that is that there is, and because I haven't been involved in many scientific, what we call eResearch projects directly, I don't know if that tension arises in those projects between understanding the building of infrastructure and having observations critically of it and what it does, the political nature of it. And I really don't know, because I haven't been involved directly in those. But I do think some of the questions we have in that huge concept of digital humanities around by building of infrastructure, it's inherently political, no matter what, whether it's actually an algorithm, whether it's selection of data, whether it's actually description of data. That whole realm is absolutely political. And I guess it's not something I think has been... well, I could be debating over this. I don't know that the political nature of it has been brought to light in the realms of collecting as much as it could be, because there's an expedience, I think, to get material out to people, and a real tension there between needing to provide services and also to understand your own biases in the way that you frame that. And when I said to you in a prior discussion, I'd witnessed some really unhappy professionals in a university library when it was recognised that a significant portion of the student populace who were from another culture weren't coming into the university library, and there was upset because there was a desire to actually make sure that student population began to use the library more and to understand that it was their space too. So I do think that those social issues are imbued in infrastructure in the humanities, possibly in a way that they may not be in science. But I have wondered, and I haven't investigated it, how much that bubbles up when there is public engagement, because you necessarily are confronted by diversity of viewpoint. There's some research here in relation to fishing and fisher communities, and those tensions between the fishers wanting to make a living and also wanting to see the environment that they work in flourish are something that scientists have to to work with and engage with, because they need those fishers potentially to help them get a grip of what's actually happening in small environments. So maybe we are seeing more broadly through public engagement those two themes of changing the way society is actually constructed and people are able to interact with material and do their research, and actually having to be more permeable rather than having these bastions, these institutions which act as kind of bastions of either collecting or research. Those boundaries are actually perhaps more permeable, and we test that every time we create them.
And we can think about the university library as a particular kind of library which represents that kind of interface between the tradition of libraries and collecting and of their role, their changing role, and of the research sector. And I think that they, and as you've said previously to me too, are absolutely vital in this transformation in knowledge and in the facilitation of that. Absolutely crucial. I mean, we're talking now, I think, about something that we began referring to, which is the transformation in institutions, in libraries, in the digital age, and especially in response to not just individual user needs, although arguably libraries are much, much more attuned on the level of policy and resourcing and continual development to those user needs than ever before, because that's because they're being measured actually now much more than ever before in terms of the value in public life. So just to circle right back to this sort of thing, we started talking about the expert and the kind of, and you've now referred to the walls being much more permeable of the institutions. Now we have these much more flexible structures, and I'd like to throw in a couple of words that are your words here from our earlier discussion, which are responsibility and responsiveness.
Yeah.
These are absolutely vital to any institution in the digital age, but particularly, maybe we could say, to libraries.
I think that's, I once had quite a fierce exchange. I'm not sure I'd call it a scrap, but with someone who was from a very technical world, and he accused me of being elitist by selecting material from the web. I used to do web archiving, and I said, I'm given a responsibility to actually use my time as a resource to try and capture web material such that it can actually be available to support research, which means that I need to have knowledge of what's being produced, and to be able to make a selection based on that range of what's being produced, and to understand potential research threads that could be actually developed by the creation of this material. And I said, don't ever underestimate the constraints of having to understand the production of cultural material, having a particular time allocation or budget to commit to that, and then the ongoing responsibilities to maintain that and to provide access to that over time. I just said, look, we may change in time to being people suggesting collecting of cultural heritage material. We see that shift already in university libraries, where the selection and the development of scholarly collections has changed in the way that that operates. It has become far less kind of craft oriented and expert focused to far more rapid selection of material and assessment of collections, because university libraries have been pressed into dealing with other areas of enabling research. And by pressed, I mean that the demands for research are shifting and changing rapidly. But I will actually say that responsiveness as an intangible quality of institutions is something that I don't think is well understood or valued. When I think of research and the transform of research in universities, I actually see the university library as core to that. And you mentioned that they are filled with people who have already been in this technical and digital world for some time, and operating as translators to assist with, building up information literacy skills. I mean, I phrased something which is a fairly clumsy conjunction of infrastructure literacy, and that the university libraries potentially have a role there to actually provide advice and guide students and academics through an understanding of what digital infrastructure is out there, because it's not built in that physical sense. So it's actually about providing what I call intellectual access, in an old-fashioned phrase, so that people know about what's available to them or what infrastructure is there, because we can't see it. It's not physical.
And it points to the increasing educational remit of libraries, which is shifting away from the storage and preservation and of the model of the researcher or the user being a consumer and to access the material and kind of take it away, as you might have with the book as you went to sit and read it, to a model of participation and to education. It's actually, I mean, we live in a pretty exciting time.
I think so.
The transformations in libraries that I've seen and have been privileged to visit around the world, as they shifted from a time that was only just a decade or a couple of decades ago, where rare items could not be accessed by anyone unless you went there and saw those objects, to what we have now, which is that those same images are being stored digitally, they're being available, they're becoming an object of study for people who could never have hoped to see them and would never have found them. It's opening up all sorts of remarkable new possibilities, but I think you'll agree that we're only just at the beginning.
Oh, I absolutely agree. And when I think about, because I've worked in, I guess, the realm of collecting for archives, collected archives, and also collecting published material, I think we see subtle shifts in the collecting world, where resources have been moved up the value chain, if you like, if I can use a phrase from the business world, where cataloguing was actually undertaken for published material. That is now moved towards the publishing point, and so there is this expertise and skill that can be applied to describing unique material. And when I think of what's collected in archives or what's retained by perhaps government or institutional archives, that's when I think we will really begin to understand the consequences of collecting digital material, because mass production has potentially inbuilt efficiencies in terms of describing something once and allowing it to be used many times. And so those themes of that publication you read back in the mid or early 21st century are really relevant here. I think
Yes.
big data is going to be a huge challenge for us, particularly with archives, if we look at the potential to collect material that we've never collected before with any particular focus. If you think of, and I haven't been involved in this, your email account.
Yeah.
And how we retain someone's sense of their interior thought. You and I had a discussion about where diaries used to function as a discrete, piece of technology to enable someone to share their thoughts with their diary and potentially nobody else, because they didn't think anyone was going to read it. And that has changed with the advent of blogging, and that has impacted upon collecting and what can actually be drawn out of someone's theoretically, unaffected personal reflections. And so I think that's archives are actually where I think we are going to see some amazing potential unleashed. But I also think we will struggle to resource that. And that's where I think public engagement is really important, to look at ways to connect those worlds, as the National Library has done here, to support the correction of material. So there's an interesting kind of balance there between providing material and enabling it to be, information around it to be accreted through public engagement.
It may be a useful point for us to finish up on. The book that I was referring to, Doing Digital History, written by Dan Cohen and Roy Rosenzweig. It named a number of qualities of digital media. This was back in around 2004 when it was published. They were manipulability, accessibility, but the one that and there are a number of them, but the one that strikes me as particularly relevant here is capacity. And this vast capacity now that we have to collect, that actually means that the job is no longer one of endless collection of everything, but rather to know what to discard and how to collect, which relates to the the remit of the library, but also, and crucially, I think, to people's own digital literacy and understanding of what is valuable and what kind of, not just what's valuable, because all documents are valuable in their own way, but what you're reading when you see a particular kind of document today in digital form, and how to make sense of it at a time when so much is collected and so much can be collected. And far from meaning that we need experts and historians and curators and people like this less, far from that, it actually means we need much more of this kind of interpretation.
Or maybe it's a program of, because archival theory is really, I think, ripe for wider exposure and getting people to understand. Like, I was once accused of cutting holes in the internet when I was doing selective web archiving. And I said, look, I know that that's true, but I'm trying to make it possible for someone to actually, because we can't suck the whole internet down at this point in time. Maybe in 50 years we might be able to, I don't know. But we had lots of discussions about the accretion of information, either the continual collection and also the accretion of description, the ability to take a big blob of web material and then look at ways to actually pull or highlight aspects in it. And that is potentially making it open to maybe machine processing and also societal processing, and looking at what comes from that. I think there's some really amazing opportunities, and really it's a question of resourcing. When I think of that data cube, I like to think of something much more organic in shape when it comes to cultural data or heritage or our histories, and what will come from that, because maybe we don't want to have those same sort of rigorous intellectual structures or information architectures and ontologies. We actually want a mixture so that we can actually see what happens when people have different viewpoints on the same material.
Mm. And in that sense, we could think about it not only in terms of technological advances and new possibilities in terms of formats and standards and aggregation and dissemination that allows that kind of interlinking and that knowledge to be presented in that way, but also a kind of cultural shift in the way that people work towards valuing the multi-perspectival, the collaborative, the more fluid and dynamic way of producing and understanding and seeing and even storing knowledge in these more flexible containers in the digital frame.
Yeah, absolutely. I think absolutely. And it's people also, I think, need to understand that is every step in that is political. It's social and it's political and it's cultural. And in the way that we constructed buildings and practices to collect and also to conduct research, when we look at the transformation occurring with technology, that every single step in that process of infrastructure development and engagement is political. And there are different forces at work that want to control or enable that, and recognizing that equity, social equity, becomes perhaps a different question in the digital realm depending on the context, and that some people actually don't want that, and that's quite challenging when we think we have progressed, through Enlightenment ideas to becoming more embracing and democratic. I thought it was quite funny this morning. Yeah, and this morning the Sydney Morning Herald advertised a way for people to leak information to them such that they potentially wouldn't leave a digital trace. And I thought that was quite interesting, that we still have a need to leak information out, to get the word out through perhaps subversive means in some people's eyes, and that they have been quite open about how people can do that. And I think that as a vignette tells us quite something about the constancy of society, and yet the way that it changes with technology.
Yes, and of that kind of space in between the public presentation of knowledge and of information, and of the way that actually people can use it, and the other avenues that people find and continue to need to find, because actually that's part of being human. It's part of being, but there'll be the different modes. Yes, I think we'll finish our conversation.
Yes.
Yeah. And thank you very much. It was absolutely fantastic.
It was. Thanks, Paul. I'll stop recording.